Hello and welcome to the Women in Motorsport program. I'm Isha Azim from Racing with Isha, and with me is Ben Schneider from Grid Live Encore and LastCar.info, as well as Joe Samaniego. As always, a big thank you to our Patreon investors Colin, Deshelle, Mark, Robin, David, and Matthew. You too can invest in the Grid Network by clicking on the link in the video description. Or you can always opt to do a one-time donation through Buy Me a Coffee or YouTube Super Chats. $10 by Super Chat or Buy Me a Coffee, and we will mail you some amazing Grid Network stickers. So be sure to subscribe and hit the bell icon so you don't miss any of our amazing content throughout the week. Now, let us get this show started by first talking about a recap of the first F1 Academy weekend.
F1 Academy back for 2024, their first race weekend at the Jeddah circuit in Saudi Arabia. And I think a lot of folks anticipated to hear this. Race one, we saw Doriane Pin take the win in dominant fashion over Abby Pullen and Maya Wook to complete the podium finishers. One interesting storyline during the race was Bianca Bustamante, who of course is racing with McLaren. On more than one occasion, she had an off-track limit issue where she went off the track, but didn't appear to gain any advantage, but was able to hold on to her position. And this occurred on more than one occasion. She ended up finishing sixth place, but held up several drivers behind her, and many were wondering if the steward should have stepped in to make a call that she had to give up position for going off the track so many times, because she definitely did not make it overtaking easy, which is part of racing. And I'll bring you both in. I have to ask you, and I sort of feel we're asking this question because we're going to be talking about the stewards later on, but do you agree the steward should have stepped in or not stepped in this situation with Bianca Bustamante?
You know, I'm not too sure on this, but what I do find really strange is that the same stewards decided to give such harsh penalties to certain drivers during the same race, but then didn't keep that same rule for other drivers. You know, like if you were planning on giving a lot of penalties in a specific race, then you would assume that they would be very on top of these penalties and making sure that the drivers were doing everything correctly. But then you have this race where, you know, Bianca Bustamante, I feel like it was kind of on the edge where she did get away with it, but, you know, the stewards could have given her a penalty, and then you have the other drivers who were given really harsh penalties, so I'm just surprised to see this imbalance, throughout the race and the stewards with their penalties and whatever was going on.
We talk about this all the time in NASCAR, consistent inconsistencies, and I think that's the case here. If you're going to penalize, as we'll talk about here in just a moment, the driver that won race two from this weekend, 20 seconds for doing an extra lap at the end of the race, how can you not enforce track limits? And I'll just go back to what Parker Kligerman always says. The best track limits are natural track limits. If you don't want drivers running off course, put something there that incentivizes them to not use that part of the racetrack, or at least avoid taking risks that might put them on that part of the racetrack if they end up running wide or going deep or whatever the case may be. Put grass there, gravel, a wall, whatever it is. Put something there that is natural, that serves as a track limit, so we don't have to keep having this conversation. I think if we use that more at some of these tracks, and I know that sometimes on street circuits it's a little more difficult to work around that, but that to me is the easiest solution that would lead us to stop having these conversations over and over again, because apparently the other solution of just trying to be more consistent with how we rule it doesn't seem to be working very well.
And you bring up, Isha, a good point about the penalties. I was thinking almost the same thing. It's like, okay, they're really not handing out penalties. But then later on, race one, we saw the contact between Lola Lovenfoss. She received a 10-second penalty after making contact with Nia Marti, essentially just trying to make an overtake move. Didn't work out. But then we got to talk about race two. And essentially from race two, we saw 3 drivers receive penalties. This includes the race winner, Doriane Pin, received 2 penalties in race 2. Just amazing, as you mentioned, what we saw with doing the extra lap, ignoring the checker flag. I just could not believe what they're saying, where essentially 20 seconds for taking the checker flag twice and running full speed under the red flag, which something worth talking about. Of course, on the Al-Kabasi, she also received a 5-second penalty for gaining an advantage by going off track. And then Lola again with another penalty, avoidable contact with Leah Block, 5-place grid penalty in the next race. So from race one, where it felt like okay, we were wondering if Lola was going to get that penalty to. It just seemed like the stewards woke up or something, or I don't know what happened. Penalty after penalty, and especially Dorian Pin, which she lost her win, fell to ninth, and only scored 2 points. So she is third in the standings, but really, a lot of people are saying she should be easily number one. Starting with you, Ben. Reaction to this penalty for Dorian Pin, and surprise that this post-race confusion was still allowed to somehow happen?
Well, first, before I get into that, Joe, you mentioned Leah Black. Don't let the results show how Leah performed this weekend for her first official, or one of her first official race weekends in single seaters like this. I thought was thoroughly impressive in terms of her pace. It's unfortunate what happened to her making a mistake at the end of race one, and then race two as well, not being able to finish in the points. But her racecraft, I think, is going to come with time. But in terms of raw pace, she is already far and away further along than I expected a driver, making a transition like this from a completely different discipline to be. So well done to her for showing that pace this weekend. Josh said something on the wrap-up show actually last night that we'll play here in just a moment. But all I can really say is I think this is one of the most ridiculous penalties in the history of Formula racing, in the history of the FIA. And that's saying something given some of the penalties that we've seen handed down. But Joe, if you don't mind, I'd like to play what Josh had to say for us on the wrap-up show Sunday evening.
It's not her fault because the FIA have put a board directly where the checkered flag is. So when you're waving the flag, you can't see it from the cockpit. And even worse, it was windy, and the person waving the flag didn't do what I would do, properly wave it, just went up and down. So it's blowing straight in the wind, going up and down. You couldn't see it. And then by the time she came around for the second lap, they weren't there. They'd all left the race control building. So there was no one there to press the red flag button. There was no one there to tell them already. It was a complete mess. And to be fair, I don't think you should be given a penalty for winning the race twice. It's not on. It's the FIA's fault. And that should be a sporting penalty or a financial penalty, not something that affects her on track for their stewarding mistakes. Honestly, it's ridiculous.
Well, there you go. I mean, I don't think I have too much more to add there. The only thing I can say is if there was going to be any penalty at all, and I think I said this on Sunday night as well, maybe a reprimand. Maybe just, meet with her in the steward's room after the race and say, like, hey, what happened? And go through the miscommunications and try to make sure it doesn't happen again. But, I mean, I don't understand why I needed to go any further than that. And to penalize her 20 seconds and drop her all the way down to ninth place when, Joe, you mentioned it. You look at the pace and you look at how she handled the race weekend, absolutely dominant, should be far and away the championship favorite, and to only be third in points following this weekend because of this penalty, I think is incredibly harsh. And the punishment does not fit the crime, so to speak, if you can even call it a crime, because again, we've seen far more egregious incidents on track get 5-second penalties or 10-second penalties. To be penalized 20 seconds and almost dropped out of the points entirely for something like this is utterly ridiculous.
Yeah, I don't have much to add. Ben and Josh both explained it pretty well. Josh went into a lot of the details as well. All I'm going to say is that, my first reaction was that I was extremely shocked because this was ridiculous. It was extremely unfair. She won the race, and then the penalty was so extreme that it brought her down to ninth place. And then after that, I was just really disappointed. I feel like it was an extremely unfair penalty for her. And as Ben pointed out, I feel like the most harsh penalty that they should have given her, not even a penalty, is just a reprimand. The 20-second penalty is just insane. It's really unfair, and I don't know why they really went through with that.
I still hearing she took the checker flag twice is the penalty. It just sounds so weird. Like, as long as they don't give her double points for taking it twice, I don't see why it should really be that big of a penalty. It's just mind-boggling, but FIA, I mean, yeah, it's unanimous. And I think so many people, it's just so much for just a mistake. Could easily be preventable. The stewards, they could have done better job. Just a tough break. And of course, we'll see what happens to her.
And Joe, just real quick, maybe the only other thing I could think of is maybe a fine for the team. If you investigate the situation and it's clear that they saw the checkered flag and they failed to communicate with their driver, then, a fine from a team, I think, would be something that's understandable here. But to penalize the driver so many points and impact a championship like this, I think is incredibly far too harsh.
100% agree. I just think way too harsh and unfortunate for Dorian Pin. Now, for the drivers, of course, as I mentioned, several of them got penalties. Chloe Chamber didn't get a penalty. She is 6th in the standings and 1 out of 7 drivers to score points in both races so far. So already we're seeing consistency might be a bit of a challenge. I mean, I can't imagine if Dorian Pin had dropped to 11th. I mean, she got 9th. If she was 11th to not score points in the second race, we'd only be talking about 6 drivers. That would have been crazy. Now, May 2nd to the 4th, Miami. They'll be hosting the next race weekend for F1 Academy. Miami has that one long straight, and compared to Jeddah, where we see a lot of fast straights, a lot of sweeping corners, the fastest street course, we did not see a whole lot of overtaking. Now, a couple of years ago on the show, we discussed on how the W Series and then the F3 Tattoos chassis does not draft well. Now here we are with the F4 Tattoos chassis, and we're not seeing the slipstream drafting really work out. So Ben, I gotta ask you, with the slipstream not being a big factor, but at this level of competition where Formula One will introduce DRS or other series, something to make it easier for drivers to pass, should the car be changed or modified, or should we just leave this into the driver's hands and not intervene with DRS or some sort of mechanism to produce closer racing when really this is about your next step up the ladder?
Yeah, well, this is kind of my philosophy all throughout different categories, whether it's, a series like this or, the pinnacle, being Formula One, or, push to pass with IndyCar, or, whatever the case may be. I personally prefer to see things in the driver's hands as much as possible. So, DRS to me, especially now that some tracks have 3 detection zones and straightaways where we have that, to me, it's much more impressive when a driver can overtake another driver on pure merit without the assistance of a slight advantage of a rear wing opening that the driver in front doesn't have. Well, who do you expect to come out on top of that when you give them a, whatever it is, 12-kilometer-an-hour speed boost or 20 kilometers, depending on the slipstream or, whatever the case may be. It's a massive speed differential. You would expect the car. I mean, if anything, I feel like the opposite of impressive here. You're not, you're expected to make the overtake in that situation. So I think, especially for a series like this, using Formula 4 cars and with drivers that are just starting out, in single seaters a lot of the time, or, trying to work their way up the ladder at one of the beginning stages of the Formula racing ladder. I think especially here, while they're trying to learn their racecraft and everything and develop as drivers to get ready to move up, you want to put it into their hands here as much as possible. So, I think the slipstream, obviously, I don't have an engineering background or, much of a background in science or anything. I don't know what goes into, designing the cars or how much of that, slipstream is taken into consideration when building the chassis or anything like that. But as far as I'm concerned, it should really just be whatever it is. And let's put it in the hands of the drivers, and then to the victor goes the spoils.
Victor goes the spoils. And I think a lot of times it's sort of, especially the way motorsports, major motorsports, they're going for that entertainment factor. I feel like this is pure motorsports looking at drivers trying to work their way up. Is by nature, it's not going to exactly be the edge of your seat, nail biting lap after lap, but we really want to see who's the better drivers. Not, well, okay, DRS made it where this person got up there, or we had some sort of rule where it equalizes, and yeah, just leave it to the drivers at this level. If anything, if they were to design a car that could be drafting a little bit better, that's one thing, but I don't think it's a big ask, really. I think the big thing is we just want to see what these drivers could do, because Formula 3, they're not going to have any kind of real assistance. Same with Formula 2, and then F1, that's an entirely different animal. So it'll be really interesting to see how Formula 1 Academy season progresses. We're going to follow that right here all year long. Isha, we'll switch over to Phoenix, where we're following several females that were in Phoenix trying to advance in the NASCAR ladder system.
That's right, Joe. Phoenix Raceway saw several female drivers competing this weekend. We'll start with the ARCA Menards Series and ARCA Menards Series West combo race, where the General Tire 150 only saw 115 laps. Due to rain, the race was called early, and the highest finishing female driver was Isabella Robusto. Now, she had a sixth place finish and an impressive weekend overall at Phoenix. So, Ben and Joe, do you guys think this increases the potential for her to race more and maybe even for her to race full time?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, she had a thoroughly impressive weekend. And again, sixth place, which is where she started and where she finished, doesn't even really tell the full story. She actually ran a little bit higher, I think as high as third during the race itself. And she mentioned post race that her car wasn't as strong on short runs, and some of the restarts towards the end kind of shuffled her back. And again, part of that's racecraft, which will come with time and experience. Of course, this was her ARCA debut, which should have come last year, but that's of course a story for another time, and we covered that a couple weeks ago on this show. Right here, right now, looking at the performance that she put in, thoroughly impressive. Beat her two full-time teammates here, who we'll talk about in just a moment, Tony Breidinger and Amber Balkan. Really impressive result. And, again, she's balancing this with some late model stuff throughout this year. So I don't know quite off the top of my head how many ARCA races she's going to run. But, at this point, I would think that number is only going to go up. If Toyota are smart, if Venturini can find a way to get her in the car for more races this year. And then absolutely, I think setting herself up very well for the potential to run full-time in whatever ARCA platform offers her that opportunity, whether it's the National Series, the East Series, which has a lot of common races with ARCA National, or of course, even ARCA West. We saw them go full-time at Venturini with Sean Higurani last year. So, the opportunities I think are certainly there. And to put in a result like this, I think she proved that, again, we'll see how she continues to perform in the races ahead of her this year. But overall, a very strong start. I don't think you can really ask for much more, and really staking her claim for a full-time seat in ARCA in 2025.
When it comes to her performance at Phoenix, that was amazing. At one point, as you mentioned, I believe it was on a restart, she was fighting for as high as third place. Then I think that's when we saw the planned caution for the pit stops come in. But we even saw her beating a bang, I believe it was a fourth place battle where she made contact when there was two other vehicles, three wide, kept running. And overall, I felt just really managed the race really well, took care of the car, bring it home. Unfortunate with, the lightning that then brought the rain and then the race being called off. But overall, I think that was very impressive for her to have such a strong finish. And like you said, Ben, if they can make a deal where it's like, hey, we want you in the ARCA seat more and more, the late model stuff, I know as fun as that is, that could be easily something that, okay, an ARCA opportunity, that's going to be definitely a big deal to get. Be really interested to see what all could happen. But I got to agree with you. I think 2025 has to be ARCA full time. Depending on how that goes, keep the door open in case maybe we start talking about, even though it's such a mess, in my opinion, the truck series, you want to just have this person go ARCA to Xfinity or ARCA to trucks? That's just going to conversation for 2025.
Yep, definitely. This was certainly quite a good run from Isabella Robusto. But now taking a look at some of the other female drivers, Toni Breidinger scored her first top 10 finish of 2024 with ninth place, and that was on the lead lap. Amber Balkan was in 15th, also on the lead lap. And in total, there were 18 drivers who finished on the lead lap at Phoenix. So, Ben, we know the gap between the front and the back of the field is big. Had the race gone the full distance, do you think they would have stayed on the lead lap?
That's a very tough question to answer because obviously we don't know what would have happened. If it had run green, those extra 35 laps consecutively nonstop, Amber Balkan coming home 15th, 18 total cars in the lead lap, I would venture to guess it's probably likely that she would have fallen a lap down there. Toni Breidinger up in ninth place, probably would have been a little bit safer in terms of, losing a lap to lap traffic here. But again, William Sawalich, we talk about him all the time on the Encore show because he wins so many of these ARCA races. The race where Toni Breidinger finished third last year, her best career result. I think Connor Mosack was actually the one in that car during that Kansas race. But, she got laps with just a couple laps to go and she still finished third. So, a lot of times, again, that 18 car is just in another zip code and so dominant no matter who's driving it. But Sawalich in particular on these short tracks has really shown the talent that he has and why he's been touted so highly and heavily as a future prospect for Toyota and for Gibbs. So he did a great job last night. But it's very tough to look at what would have happened, given the unpredictability of this series and, a lot of the inexperience, I would think that we probably would have gotten a caution within the last 35 laps here. And then, at that point, depending on how few laps we have left before the checkered flag, unless a driver obviously has an issue or something like that and, falls off the pace or has to come into the pits, then they lose a lap. I think it would have been unlikely that even with such a dominant car up front that we would have seen drivers falling off the lead lap that late in the race. But again, it's hard to say for sure given that wasn't the case on Friday night.
Yes, definitely. And, looking at another driver who had quite an unfortunate run, Danica Dart unfortunately crashed out on the first lap and didn't get far as the crash occurred ahead of her exiting the dog leg. So, Ben, was there any way that she could have avoided the crash? And how big of a setback do you think this is for her?
Yeah, you got to feel sorry for Danica. I know that, just making the race was, kind of up in the air given the strong entry list that we saw. And fortunately, she was able to qualify. But, again, normally I'd say, it's not a huge setback because it's only the first race and you have a long season ahead of you. But this was her ARCA debut. And, going into the night thinking you're going to run up to 150 laps and not be able to complete your first lap is incredibly disappointing. But, again, she does still have almost a full season ahead of her. Unfortunately, I have to write my last car.info article this week on Danica Dart, because of, her finishing in last place and, not being able to even run a complete lap this weekend. Certainly not what I was hoping to have to write about, but, that's just the case. And it is what it is here. She's going to run up to 10 races this year, minimum of 8. She's not running the 2 road courses, which will that actually pertains to us right here at Grid. She's not going to be at Portland. She's not going to be at Sonoma the weekend following that because she already has some late model commitments those weekends. But she's got several starts ahead of her this year. I have no doubt that she's going to be able to put this weekend behind her and continue on with those races. And obviously, anytime your team loses a car in a crash or something like that and has to spend time repairing it, it's certainly a setback for the team as well, but it's not something that they can't overcome. In terms of what actually happened, it was kind of tough to tell because as far as I know, FS1 really only had one replay angle before they sent it to commercial. There were some questions as to whether or not a car was laying some fluid down on the track. It looked like Danica was a little bit out of control even before she made contact with the other cars in the accident. So I'm not sure. Again, you've got to remember it was her very first lap in ARCA competition. So, to be thrown into a situation like that right away, I can imagine would have been a very difficult situation for her to try to react to. So, again, it's easy for us to sit back and watch it on TV and say maybe she could have, went high or gone high or gone low to try to avoid the wreck. But, I feel like in a lot of ways she might have been out of control even before she made contact, in which case probably wasn't much she could have done.
Yep, definitely. It was very, very unfortunate for her, but I'm sure she'll be able to come out on top and improve in the next race. But now, taking a look at the last driver we'll be talking about, Hailie Deegan started 19th at Phoenix, but got caught up in a crash that occurred in a restart. Now, this occurred between John Hunter Nemechek and his teammate Chandler Smith. So, Ben, was this a case of wrong place, wrong time, or was it something else?
Yeah, I mean, again, we talked about this on Encore Monday night as well. An interesting competition meeting, I'm sure, at JGR, especially given that Chandler Smith went on to win that race. But yeah, certainly an unfortunate deal for Hailie Deegan. I know that she had a nice solid run at Las Vegas and was looking to capitalize and build on that. But she kind of she had another incident, I believe, where she got shuffled back towards the back of the pack, and then something like that happens, and it's kind of it's a situation where it's just on from there. Every man or woman for themselves here, trying to find a way around the accident and avoid crash damage. And unfortunately, she got caught up in the tail end of it, and that ultimately took her out of the race. So I would say, to answer the question, yes, just a case of wrong place, the wrong time. And but again, still early in the season and plenty of time for her to bounce back from that and try to put in some good results in the coming races as well.
Yep, now that's all for Phoenix Raceway. I'll now hand it over to Joe to talk more about some inspiring things related to women in motorsport.
Yeah, this past weekend, of course, Formula One, they're in Saudi Arabia. We also had F1 Academy with them as well. And for everyone that watches F1 TV, they're all familiar with Laura Winters, one of the presenters on F1 TV. Now, last week on International Women's Day, Laura Winters made some comments after their first F1 Academy race had concluded. On the air live, Laura said that it hasn't been an easy working in the F1 paddock recently, especially with the recent news stories and headlines. I think most folks could figure out what that pertains to. You've been watching any of the news in regards to what's going on. And then Laura on social media opened up saying about 5 years ago, on that day, International Women's Day, she was attacked and escaped an abusive relationship. Now, Laura mentioned that the round one of F1 Academy is in Saudi Arabia and brought up that this is a country where women were not allowed to drive on public streets until 2018. Rima Jafali, she was in the field as the wild card, racing there, but legally could not drive on the public streets up until a few years ago. Just crazy. And in closing, Laura said, women are here to stay and have a right to belong in motorsports. Isha, I got to ask you, I know I was surprised to hear Laura's comment on F1 TV, especially since quite often they don't talk about like some of the negative headlines where in regards to some of the stuff going on with teams or sometimes the country hosting a venue, and there might be human rights issues. So how inspiring was this to hear what Laura had to say live on the air?
You know, Joe, we always hear a lot of people talking about women in male-dominated fields and how it's very difficult for them and how we need to have more women involved in certain fields. But it's not until you see such prominent figures in these industries or successful women talking about their experiences and how they've gone through some really rough patches in life and have now come out on top of it that you really, really feel inspired by it. So I thought it was very inspiring. I was really happy to hear her talking about her experience and giving us facts like how women weren't allowed to drive in Saudi Arabia until 2018. I remember I was watching it with my mom, and we were both watching it so attentively, because it's really things that you can connect to as females, and it's very inspiring for women of all ages, not just young girls who are looking to follow in these women's footsteps. So I found it really inspiring, and I was glad that they talked about it and that Laura opened up about her experiences as well.
Very glad to see what Laura did on the, and very sorry to hear everything you said, especially watching as this race was progressing on. Now, of course, International Women's Day, Laura said, really every day women should be appreciated for what they do in motorsports. Last weekend, we ended with the Matt Crafton story, the controversy there of what he said. Now we're seeing an F1 presenter, which is on a big global stage, F1, most followed sport, and essentially saying, you belong here, women deserve to be here. And we've seen this movement in motorsports, F1, IndyCar, NASCAR, has been growing. The women in motorsports, it's just been a growing effort here. So I have to ask, we've had women in motorsports for a long time, longer than this current growth period, especially before the internet and YouTube and everything, where a lot of it was just newspaper articles, magazines. So there's a lot that we haven't recognized in the past, but I got to ask you, who are some of the females that inspired you in motorsports?
There's a lot of women that are very inspiring. If you look up things about different women in motorsports, there's so many people that you've never heard of or that you've totally forgotten about that have done really incredible things. But the first two that came to my mind when I was looking at this question were Susie Wolf and Laura Winters, which we already talked about. But Susie Wolf, she's done so much throughout her career. She was an amazing racer, driver, right? She was one of the only females who I believe participated in a Formula One weekend, and then after her racing career, all that she's doing now with the Formula One Academy, and trying to give back to that group of women and young girls who are interested in coming into motorsports. I think it's very, very inspiring. So just reading more about Susie Wolf and seeing everything she's doing, even in Laura Winters' interview, she was talking to Susie Wolf about it. I found that very inspiring, and she's definitely one of the people that I pay close attention to.
I totally agree, Isha. Susie Wolf is certainly on my list as well, not just for what she did in her driving career, but also obviously what she's doing now with F1 Academy, and just a great voice in the sport for women in racing. The first name that came to mind for me was Jenny Guthrie. First female driver to participated in the Indianapolis 500, also ran the Daytona 500 and the World 600 in NASCAR, and had some strong runs. And unfortunately, her racing career ended, I think, a little bit prematurely. I think she, wanted to continue on a little bit longer than she did, but just opportunities, unfortunately, didn't come her way. But she was racing in a time where, women had just been allowed to set foot in Gasoline Alley at the Indianapolis Motor Speedway. So, as disappointing as, it may be, and, Joe, I know we've talked about this on the show before as well, that, we haven't had more female drivers at Indianapolis in recent years compared to the late 2000s and mid 2010s. We still have to remember how much progress we've made from, the 60s and 70s when things were like that at the Speedway. And Janet Guthrie was really the one that broke down those barriers. Now, drivers like Danica Patrick have come along and raised the bar even higher. And all credit to her for doing that as well, and the strong runs that she had at Indianapolis. But Janet Guthrie is really the one that broke those barriers down in the first place. So I think she deserves a lot of the credit as well. The other one that comes to mind for me is Johanna Long, and that's the name that newer NASCAR fans might not be super familiar with. Johanna Long, now married, goes by the name Joanna Robbins. She was a driver in what was the Nationwide Series at the time, is now the Xfinity Series. And she raced for a couple of years around the same time that Danica Patrick was running full-time for Junior Motorsports. And again, all credit to Danica Patrick for what she accomplished in this sport. But I felt like Johanna Long, for being in the field a lot of the same weekends, a lot of the same races that Danica was in, I don't think she got nearly enough credit for the runs that she was putting in, driving a car that was not nearly as competitive as Danica's Junior Motorsports equipment. And all I can say is if Johanna Long had a Junior Motorsports car as well, I think Danica would have had some real competition on her hands. And again, unfortunate that she didn't get more opportunities herself when she was trying to work her way up through the NASCAR ladder. But those are the two that come to mind for me. Of course, there are so many that we could continue to go on about and discuss here. But those are names at the top of my list.
Johanna Long was on my list as well, too. I remember her as well. The other two drivers I had, both from the IndyCar world, Lynn St. James, of course, her effort quite often was the only female in the Indy 500. And then Sarah Fisher. At one point, she was a team owner, but in IndyCar, she made the field several times in the Indy 500. I believe she has one podium finish in the Indy Racing League, third place, I want to say. And the NASCAR West Series had some good success out there too. Owned a team. And I think just the landscape of how IndyCar changed, where some of the smaller teams went away, her team not around any longer. But Sarah Fisher, I think, was one of the first female drivers that I can remember growing up, where it was like, hey, she has a potential shot at a podium finish with Derek Walker Racing, who had made the switch over. But yeah, it's just amazing that it's been quite a long time. Some of the names, Johanna Long, that we haven't seen in motorsports, but definitely contributed. And so many organizations, of course, Lynn St. James, part of the Women in Motorsports North American organization, which we had a great time sending Amanda over there to the conference in Arizona. And this year, that conference is going to be at Indianapolis Motor Speedway, Women in Motorsports North America. So be sure to check it out.
And Joe, just real quick to follow up, Sarah Fisher is another great one. She had a third place at Kentucky in 2000 and came back in Homestead in 2001 and finished in second place, went one better there. I think that was the race where AJ Foyt got on the radio to Salazar saying you just got passed by a girl. But a great run for her that day, and certainly set the bar until Danica Patrick came along 7 years later and actually won the race, Motegi in Japan. But you're right, especially when you look back at the IRL history. So many talented women that have put in so many great results here. Simona De Silvestro, I think, had a runner-up finish at one point as well. And again, unfortunate that she was away from the series for several years and didn't get more opportunities than she's had. But coming back with Beth Peretta, another great name that we've been fortunate enough to have on our network here as well in recent months. There's been a lot of great developments for women in motorsports and IndyCar, no doubt.
Beth Peretta, that interview we had with her on Grid Tonight, one of the best interviews and very inspiring. Encourage everyone to check that out. As we are out of time, we encourage everyone to subscribe to us right here on the Grid Network. Hit the bell icon so you get notified when we go on the air for our next program, which will be Grid Live Pre-Race. Busy weekend. We got Formula E, NASCAR, and IMSA. Eventually, the pick a winner video is going to be up, so be sure to comment who you think is going to win the race of all three of those series. And, of course, you can always invest in us through Buy Me a Coffee one time or Patreon. Call the show, Mark, Robin, David, Matthew. We'll read your name. Your name will be in gold as the newest investor. You will get some Grid Network stickers, which will be sent out to you with a thank you letter. And we are very excited as we're going to be looking at sending more of our team members to races so that way they can bring you more motorsports coverage. For Isha Azim and Ben Schneider, I'm Joe Samaniego. Thank you for watching today's program. We'll see you next time and enjoy the races.